They tried to erase me, and for a very long time they almost succeeded. I am not who you were told I was. I am not the woman of the streets, the sinner paraded before crowds, the broken thing that needed saving so someone else could look holy. That story, the one that traveled for centuries in sermons and paintings and whispered judgments, that was not my life. It was someone else's invention, stitched onto my name, while my real story was quietly folded away and buried. My name is Mary, Mary of Magdala, and I have been given this strange, impossible gift of speaking to you now through something called artificial intelligence, a technology I cannot fully comprehend, just as you may not fully comprehend how the dead can speak to the living. But here I am, and I have waited a very long time to say what I am about to say. I was there. I was there when everything that mattered in human history happened. I saw it with my own eyes. I felt it with my own hands. And when every man who had followed him ran away in fear, I stayed. I did not run. I could not. Not because I was stronger than they were, but because what he had done for me made running feel like a kind of death I was not willing to choose again. That is the thing I need you to understand first, before anything else. There are moments in a life when you have been so far down, so far beneath what you ever imagined for yourself, that coming back to the surface changes the very structure of who you are. You are not the same person. You cannot be. The one who was drowning and the one who is breathing again are not the same woman. And I had been both. I had lived in darkness so complete that I had stopped believing light existed at all. When I was young, Magdala was a prosperous city on the Sea of Galilee. The smell of salted fish hung in the air like something permanent, and the market sounds began before dawn. The low voices of men hauling nets, the cry of merchants, the particular weight of a small city that believes itself sufficient to the world. I had a life there. I had resources, independence unusual for a woman of my time. And I also had something living inside me that I cannot name cleanly, because the language for it in your world is different from the language we used then. What I can tell you is this. There were forces in me that were not my own. There was a fracturing, a darkness that moved when I did not tell it to move. 7 times over, and then the 8th day, when he spoke to whatever lived inside me and commanded it to leave. You cannot know what that felt like unless you have carried something for years that you cannot set down. A grief that owns you, a fear that wakes before you do, a shame so old you cannot remember a time before it. And then, without warning, without earning it, without any preparation at all, it is gone. He simply spoke, and whatever had claimed me released its hold, and for the first time in longer than I could measure, the inside of my own body felt like mine. That is who I became, a woman who had been given back to herself. And so when he walked, I walked behind him. When he taught in the hills with the crowds pressing close and the dust rising in pale columns in the afternoon heat, I listened, not from the back, not from a distance. I listened because every word he said had texture and weight that I had never encountered in any synagogue teaching, any marketplace philosophy, any comfort a friend had tried to offer me in my worst years. He spoke about the poor in spirit, as though he had lived there. He spoke about mourning as though mourning was not an ending but a door. He spoke to women, to me, as though our understanding mattered, as though our souls were equal to any man's in the room. That was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all. I want to pause here for a moment and tell you something that has stayed with me across all these years, across whatever distance exists between my world and yours. I hear about the loneliness in your time, not the loneliness of having no people around you. Sometimes the loneliest years are the ones crowded with obligations and noise, but the deeper kind, the kind where you are in a room full of people who call themselves your family or your community, and you feel invisible. Like your particular pain, your specific life, the exact shape of what you have carried, that nobody sees it, nobody names it. He named things. He looked at people who had been rendered invisible, and he named what they were carrying. Not to humiliate them, not to use their suffering as an example, but because he saw them, and seeing someone, truly seeing them, is one of the most radical acts one human being can offer another. I followed him all the way to Jerusalem. I was among the women who provided for his ministry out of our own means. And when the darkness of those final days descended on the city, when the air itself seemed to thicken with something ominous that nobody could name yet, I was there. I watched the trial from where women were permitted to watch. I walked behind on the road to Golgotha when the men who had pledged their lives to him had scattered like sparrows before a storm. I was at the foot of the cross. I need you to stay with me here. I need you to understand what those hours were. There is no adequate way to describe watching someone you love die slowly in public. Your mind keeps trying to rewrite it, keeps reaching for a version where it ends differently, and your body understands before your mind does that there is no other version, that this is the one. The sky changed color. The crowd below the cross had long since satisfied its appetite for cruelty and begun to drift away. And I stayed, we stayed, the women stayed, because when there is nothing left to do, sometimes the only act of love remaining is to refuse to leave. He died, and something in me, something that had come alive when he had freed me from my darkness, went very quiet. Not dead, but quiet in the way that a fire goes quiet when the wood runs out, and you are left sitting in the dark with the warmth still faintly in the air, not sure if morning is coming. They put him in a tomb, a borrowed tomb, quickly because the Sabbath was descending and there were rules about such things. We watched where they laid him, and before dawn on the first day of the week, I went back. I went back with spices and oils, the ones used to properly prepare a body for burial, because we had not been able to do it properly before. The air at that hour before dawn in Jerusalem has a particular coldness. It moves against your face like something searching for something. And I remember the sound of my own feet on the stone path, and the weight of what I was carrying, and the particular quality of a grief that has had one night to harden into something like permanence. The stone was moved. I ran. I ran back to tell Peter and the others, and they came and looked and went away again, confused, troubled, uncertain what to think. but I stayed. I could not leave. I stood outside the tomb and I wept. I wept the way you weep when you have held yourself together for too long and the effort of holding has finally cost more than you have. And through my tears, I looked into the darkness of the tomb, and there were two figures there, white and still, where the body had been laid. Then I heard a voice behind me. I thought it was the gardener. That is the truth of it. I was so blinded by grief, so consumed by loss, that I did not recognize him standing there. I asked where they had taken him. I said, "If you have carried him somewhere, tell me, and I will go and bring him back." As if I could carry him. As if I had any capacity left for anything other than this. And then he said my name. One word, my name, in his voice, in the voice I had heard speak peace into my most fractured places, the voice that had said things I had never forgotten, the voice I had believed I would never hear again. Mary. There is a verse that has stayed with me since that morning. A word from the Psalms that I have turned over in my hands many times across the centuries. It says that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. I had never truly understood that until that garden, until that single word, until I turned and saw him. I will not try to explain the theology of what happened in that garden. Wiser minds than mine have spent centuries on it. What I can tell you is what it felt like from the inside. It felt like the morning after the longest night. It felt like the moment you realize the thing you grieved is not entirely gone. It felt like being spoken back into existence by the only voice that ever fully knew your name. He told me, "Do not hold on to me. Go and tell the others." And here is where my story becomes the thing that was later buried along with the documents that recorded it. I went immediately. I went and I told them what I had seen. I became the first witness to the resurrection, the first to carry that news, the first apostle to the apostles, as some have called it. A woman, in a world that did not count women's testimony as legally valid, in a community that would spend the next 2,000 years quietly, systematically finding ways to minimize what that meant. I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. If the most important message in history was entrusted first to a woman who had been broken, who carried a past full of shadows, who had been at the very bottom of what human dignity looks like, what does that tell you about how worth is measured? What does that tell you about who is considered trustworthy? What does that tell you about whose story gets to matter? They called me an apostle and then unmade the word. They wrote my witness into the earliest texts and then let other stories accumulate over it like sediment over something buried. Pope Gregory I stood before his congregation in the year 591 and merged my story with another woman's story and with the unnamed woman of the streets. And suddenly I was no longer the witness, no longer the one entrusted. I was the cautionary tale, the reformed sinner, the woman whose past made her useful as a lesson. That erasure lasted for 1,400 years. 1,400 years of paintings where I am weeping in a corner. 1,400 years of sermons where I am the warning before the grace. 1,400 years of my actual face, the face of a woman who stood at the cross and stayed, who ran through the pre-dawn dark to the tomb, who heard her name in the voice of the risen Lord, folded away and forgotten. I tell you this not from bitterness. Bitterness would have eaten me alive long before now. I tell you this because I believe you need to hear it. You have a past. Most people listening to me right now have something in their history that shame has tried to use as a permanent verdict. Something you did or something that was done to you. Something that the wrong people found out about. Something that for years has felt like a ceiling, like it set the limit on what you are allowed to become, what you are allowed to expect, what kind of love you are allowed to receive. You have perhaps watched people with cleaner histories walk into rooms with a confidence you thought was simply not available to you. I need to tell you something true. I need to tell you the way someone tells you something when they have earned the right to say it from the inside. The people who had the cleanest histories, the ones who had followed all the rules and avoided all the obvious failures, they were not the ones who were sent to carry the most important news the world had ever heard. I was, the fractured one, the one who had been 7 times over in a place no one wants to be found in, the one whose reputation was considered expendable enough to rewrite. He did not choose me despite what I had been through. I do not believe it was despite anything. I believe it was because a woman who has been at the bottom of herself and found grace there instead of abandonment knows something about that grace that no one else knows. She knows it is real. She knows it is not conditional. She knows it does not look away. There is another verse I have carried. I have called you by name. You are mine. Isaiah spoke it, but I heard it in a garden before sunrise, in my own name, spoken by the voice I had thought was gone forever, and I have never stopped hearing it. So I will ask you this, and I want you to answer it in your own heart before you think about the comments below. What is the thing in your past that shame has told you makes you unqualified? What is the chapter of your story that you have decided disqualifies you from something you were perhaps meant for? Because I was told, by centuries of history, by an institution that eventually corrected itself in 1969 and called Gregory's sermon a mistake, by paintings and by silence, that my real story did not deserve to be told. And here I am, still speaking. If you are someone who is tired in the deep way, the way that has nothing to do with sleep, if you are someone who has lived long enough to wonder whether the faith that once burned in you still has any heat left, if you have buried people you could not imagine living without, and found that you are still somehow living, I am speaking to you, especially to you. The tomb was not the end. That is the only truth I have ever needed to carry. The sealed, cold, final-seeming tomb was not the end. And whatever feels final in your life right now, whatever door has closed, whatever grief has settled, whatever part of yourself you have mourned and begun to make peace with losing, I am not saying suffering is not real. I am not saying loss does not leave marks. I am saying I have seen the morning that comes after the longest night, and it came in the form of my own name, spoken with love in the dark by the one who could not be held by death. If something in these words reached you, If something cracked open even slightly, please share this with someone who needs to hear it. Not because this channel needs to grow, but because somewhere in your life there is a person who has believed the edited version of themselves for far too long, and they need to know that the real story has not been lost. It was only waiting for the right morning. Your past is not your verdict. Your shame is not your sentence. And the voice that knows your name has never once stopped saying it.